Hello and welcome back to the quiz application. Now the goal of this video is to replace our static question with dynamic data which will be fed into our application for it to display quizzes in the quiz component. I have created a GitHub gist which is a JSON file which contains an array of questions. So here's the JSON file, and this is what the question looks like. A question is an object, and each question has a question property which contains the question for that question, and then there's an option A, B, C, and D, and then there's an answer. So the answer always matches one option, which is usually the correct option in the question. So our JSON file contains about 15 of these objects. So what we'll do is this: I'll copy this entire JSON file and I'll leave a link to this file in the description. You can just grab the link from here if you want, but I'll leave a link in the description. So I'll just copy this entire JSON file from top to bottom. Copy that, and over in my text editor in the source folder, in components, or I'll just drop it in the source folder. So in the source folder, I'll create a file called questions.json, and I'll paste what I just copied into that file. So we have our questions in this questions JSON file. Now over in the play component, I'll just bring in those questions. So up here, I'll import questions from // to go out of the quiz folder, // to go out of the components folder, // to go out and into the source folder, not into the source folder but to go into the questions.json file. So this returns the contents of this JSON file and puts them in these questions here. So let me just double check that one more time. So // to go up one directory will be in the components folder, and going up one more time will be in the source folder. And okay, so we can get our JSON file from here. Now before I go further, I'll just in the render method above the return, I'll just console.log the questions. Now logging the questions out, we should see our questions display when we visit that component. So I'll go to play, and over in that questions component, I'll just invoke or open my developer tools, and we should see, okay, very good. We have an array here of 15 items, and if I expand or collapse this, if I expand it, sorry to say, we have from 0 to 14 because arrays are 0 based. So the first item here is at the position 0, and if I expand this object, we can see we have a question property here which says what temperature does water boil at, and our option A is 100 degrees Celsius, option B is 50 degrees Celsius, option B is 25 degrees Celsius, and the rest are just that. So let's add our application or component state, not application but component state, to our quiz or play component. So I'll just comment this file, this constructor. Now the first thing we have is a questions. So the questions, and it's going to be an empty array, and then after the questions we'll have a current question in our state, and this will be an object which is empty for now, and then we'll have a next question, and the next question will be empty by default. We also have, why do I have an error here? Current questions, what's wrong? Okay, I haven't defined my state. So this dot state, our state is an object, and I'll just cut these 3 into the state. So paste. That's why we're having that error there. So after the next question, we're having a previous question. So previous question, and it will be empty by default. The next will be answer, and this will be an empty string. We also have a number of questions, and by default it's going to be 0, and we'll have a number of answered questions, and answered questions. This will also be 0 by default. We'll have a current question index, and this will be 0, and the user score will be 0 by default. We'll have correct answers, which is the number of correct answers. It will be 0 by default, and the wrong answers will be 0 also by default. So wrong answers, this is 0. Our hints will be 5. 50 50 will be 2. We'll have a used 50-50 state, used 50-50, and by default it will be false. And well, that's what we'll have for now. Let me just add the time also. The time will be an empty object. So now let's create our display questions function or method. So outside the constructor, so you want to be sure you're outside the constructor, and I'll get rid of this old increase count function from the other tutorial. So this will be display questions, and it's going to be an arrow function. Now this display questions method or function will have a couple of parameters here. Now the first one will be the questions array, and by default is going to be set to this.state.questions, which is the questions array in our state. I'll just hide this one to have more space. Then the next parameter will be the current question. So current question. We'll also have a next question. We'll also have a previous question as arguments to this method. Now what do we want to do in the method? First of all, we want to destructure the current question index from our state. So let's, in curly braces, current question index, current question index, and it's going to be from this dot state. So we are pulling off the current question index from our state, which we have up here. Where's our current question index? This one here. So that's what we're doing. Now I want to check if our array or our state is empty, our question is empty. Now to do that, I will say if is empty is empty. Now what are we checking to see if it's empty? Why is it not autocorrecting? We're checking if this dot state dot questions is empty. We can just call these questions, because either way it refers to the state. So we're checking if it is not empty, so I'll add a negation up before the is empty, and this function has not been created, but we'll create that before running our code. So if it's not empty, then there are questions in it. And what do we want to do? I will just set this one back to the this.state.questions. Now if it's not empty, I want to set my questions, which is this argument that will be passed in here, questions, to be equal to the questions in our state, this.state.questions. Now after that, our current question, which is this argument passed in here, is going to be equal to the questions array, and we're looking for the first item, since initially our question is, or since initially our question, how do I put it, we want to pull off the first question in the array. So questions, now from the questions array, we want to get the first item, and we'll be getting that from the current question index, which initially is 0. So current question index, so that will set the current question to be the first item, or whatever the index is at that time, which in our case will be 0, which makes it the first question. Then our next question is going to be equal to pulling off from the questions array the current questions index, current question index, and adding 1 to it, and then the previous question also. Previous question is going to be from our questions array, subtracting 1 from the current question index, that's going back. Now our answer, the answer to each question or to the question, is going to be, we have a local variable here called answer, and it's going to be equal to the current question dot answer, because each question has an answer property on it. Now we've been able to pull out our questions from, or our question from the questions array. Now we just want to set our state to update it. So this dot set state, our current question on our state is going to be equal to the current question variable here. So current question. Now with ES6, when the key and the property are the same, we can leave out the second one. So this is that. So the current question is the current question, the next question is also the next question. We also want to set the previous question and set the answer too. Now this call to this dot set state is going to update our state up here with the results from our function. So that's that for now for the display questions function. Now the next thing I'll do is to create this is empty function. So to do that, over in our source folder, we'll create a file or a folder called utils. So in the source folder, we'll have a new folder, call this folder utils, and inside utils we'll have an isEmpty file, so is-empty.js. Now inside isEmpty, we'll be writing a function to check if a given value passed into it is empty. So the isEmpty file is going to be a function which we'll name is empty, and it's going to take in a value and return something based on a certain condition. So if the value passed in is equal to undefined, or the value is null, or the type of the value is an object. So if the value passed into this function is an object, and I'll just type this out and explain it then after typing. So object.keys, passing in the value dot length is equal to 0, or type of value is equal to string and value dot trim dot length is equal to 0. So this function will return true. I have an error here, so let me just see where I went wrong. Just bring this one to the second line. So if value is equal to undefined, or value is null, or type of value, we should check for the value. So if the value is undefined, this function will return true, or if the value is null, the function will also return true, meaning it's empty. Or if the value passed in here, if the type of the value passed in here is an object and the keys of the object have a length of 0, that means that object has no property on it. So if the length of the keys is 0, it's also empty. Or if it's a string and when we run the trim method on that string, it returns us with a length of 0, we also know that our value is empty. So we'll be exporting this function for use outside this file. So export default is empty. Now over in play, I'll import our isEmpty function. So import is empty from dot slash to go out of the quiz component, dot slash to go out of the components folder, and then / utils / is dash empty. Now we have our isEmpty function be returned to us here. So whenever we call this function here, now we should not have an error. Now let me just check to see that there's no error in our page. So I'll reload that and everything is working fine, everything is all good. Now the next thing we'll do is to display call this display method when our application or our component loads, and we can do that using the lifecycle method called component did mount. So component did mount. Now this method gets called whenever our component loads. So I'll simply say this dot display questions. Now our questions is going to be from this dot state dot questions, and then our current question is going to be from this dot state dot current question. I'll just hide this one for more space, and then our next and previous questions will also come from our state. Now to even make this shorter, I'll just up here create a const, and I'll destructure, or I'll get our state of this. So I'm getting our state from this, so I can simply say here state dot questions, or to even simplify further, I can say this dot state. So here I can get the questions. So I'm getting the questions from our state here, up here, the questions array. I'm also getting, or I also get the current question, the next question, and the previous question, and this should be a comma. Now we're pulling off our questions array, our current question, the next question, and the previous questions from our state. So I'll just replace or pass them inside our method call. So this is questions, this is current question, and this will be the next question and the previous question. So our method is getting called now. Now the last thing we have to do is just to modify our question here, our questions down here, to display information from our state. So up here, I'm going to just cut out this Google was founded in what year and replace it with our question from our state. So up here below this console log, I'll just take this away So I'll create a constant and we'll have our question. This will be our current question, and it's going to be equal to this dot state. Now remember, back in our not question but current question, back in our display questions method, we are setting the current question here. So we're pulling off the question and the options from this current question. So up here, this h5 now will no longer display this static text, but it will display current question dot question, and this should return us the question for our current question. And then for this first option, it will display us, or it will display current question dot option A. Now just copy this and paste and modify for the other ones. So copy that. This will be option B, and this should be option C, and the last one should be option D. So if we did everything well and we didn't make any mistakes, we should be seeing the first question from our questions array displayed on our page. So let's check that. So I'll reload it. Our questions are not loading. What's the issue? Questions is defined but never used on line 4. So let's see. That's in our play component on line 4. Questions. How come I didn't use questions here? Okay, here. So here's what I'll do. I'm going to modify this. I'm going to modify our states, and by default our state is going to be our questions array is going to point to this questions import from here. So I can say questions is what? Questions. And now so this questions property is pointing to the questions import which you have up here, but with ES6, when a property, a key and a value are the same, we can always shorten it by taking out one. So questions now points to questions. So our questions are currently in our state, and I guess everything is fine for now. So let's check. Okay, very good. We can see now that what temperature does water boil at, and we have 50 degrees Celsius, 100 degrees Celsius, 25 degrees Celsius, and 150 degrees Celsius. And we know we are getting this from our JSON file, because if I come over back in our text editor and go into our source folder, into our questions, we can see that this is the first question from our JSON file. So in next video, we'll begin programming our question to detect whether the user selects the right or wrong answer.